Welcome to the Association's Futures Podcast, brought to you by Association Activision. We ask you to join us to discuss the future of the Association's community. How can we build and focus on the many futures we will see during these disruptive times? Let's get started with today's guest.
Hi, friends. I'm Michael Butera, your host for the Association Futures Podcast. Today's guest is Wanda Little-Coffey, MBA, CAE, Certified Association Executive, Senior Director for Volunteer Relations at the American Society of Association Executives. I've had the pleasure of knowing Wanda for several years, and I've seen how she navigates the ups and the downs of maintaining, recruiting, and developing volunteers and volunteer activities. Wanda is an outstanding association management professional with extensive volunteer and program management expertise. She specializes in improving the dynamics of groups with an emphasis on increasing visibility and improving the connection to the mission. We are fortunate to have Wanda as our guest today. Wanda, welcome to the Association Futures Podcast.
Well, thank you, Michael, for the invitation.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you with us. Hey, I'm kind of interested. How'd you get started on this journey in the association world?
Well, I think like many people, I hadn't really thought about nonprofits as a place to make a career. I got my MBA, University of Wisconsin in Madison, and started, my specialty was marketing and product and price management specifically. And so I started down that road. I came home back to Maryland and started working in various for-profit organizations handling their marketing or their sales programs. And but I sort of specialized in startups, people who were experimenting. I love a pilot. The problem with that is that often you will come to work and find out you are no longer employed. The organization has shut its doors. I've had that happen more than once. And eventually it was like, right now you're just starting out. You don't have lots of bills, this is fine. But eventually you're going to have to find something that's going to really pay the rent. And so during one of the times in which the organization closed, I'm old enough for us to have posted jobs in a newspaper. And so I was reading the want ads and I saw this job and I was like, never really thought about that. It was with the American Red Cross. And in the day-to-day, I saw it, but I forgot about it. The job appeared again. And I was like, okay, universe, I get it. I'm supposed to go apply for that. And so I applied for the job. I came in as an account manager. And my job at that point was working with organizations, churches, community groups who were about to put on a blood drive. So it was doing education and was helping them manage the process. It was recruiting volunteers because when you give blood, there's somebody at the end who makes sure that you have juice and cookies. And so that was my job. And actually, it went very well. I'd never thought of doing marketing in that way because there's the posters and there's all the communication that has to go out into the community or into the organization to encourage people to participate. I eventually became the assistant director for their key accounts, which means I had Baltimore and DC, places like Johns Hopkins, where I don't know if they still do it, but they used to run a blood drive there for 2 whole weeks. And eventually my last position with them was I was the director of minority donor outreach. So I started a program to reach into the African American community, explain the need, for blood donors, people who did pheresis and bone marrow even at one point. And I ran all the way from probably the Maryland line north all the way down into Loudoun County, Virginia.
Wow.
The major city and government agencies talking about the need across really all groups, but specifically in African American communities. My program was the most successful one at that time within the Red Cross. Others had tried it. My particular, so I worked for Blood Donor Services out of Baltimore, and others had tried it. We got a grant for me to do it because I had started actually before we got the grant. And so for 3 years, the national office paid my salary so that I could enact this program. I worked with our communications team. We had special collateral, so posters, videos. I did training for staff because my objective was at the end of this that they would not need someone, a one person to do this. This would be part of our culture.
That's really spectacular. I happen to work with the NAACP here in Maryland on their
Hmm.
blood drives,
Right.
which maybe are an outgrowth of what you were doing all that
Yeah.
time ago.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
wonderful to hear that.
Well,
So,
and their headquarters isn't far from where from the headquarters in which I used to work. So,
yeah, that's right. It's right here in Baltimore, although they're
right.
talking about moving to DC, right?
Yeah.
Hey, so in your current role,
Mhm.
tell me what the real challenges are that you face in obtaining and maintaining a volunteer activity.
Well, I think most of it is time. And we've known that really all the way back to ASAE's decision to join research. We started with decision to join probably almost 20 years ago, and went on to decision to volunteer. So we know even then, and even as you look at some of our foresight drivers,
Mhm.
that time is an issue. People have smaller and smaller amounts of time to volunteer. And so the challenge is working with staff to create opportunities that are short in duration. We will always have groups that will sign on for a year,
Mhm.
and will have much more advisory capacity to the organization. They'll sort of look across that 30,000-foot level and say, here's what we see, here's what we see now, here's what we see in the future, and here are the gaps we see in terms of resources for the membership. But time is really the biggest one, and being able to break the jobs down so that you can tell people succinctly what needs to be done and the time frame it needs to be done in, and then tracking it all.
Right. So one of the things you're mentioning here, I think, is really important, and that is that volunteers need to know just how much time this particular
Yes.
volunteer activity is going to take, and that
Mhm.
works to maintaining them. Is it, am I understanding you
Yeah.
correctly? Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, over the years, I think about when I started. You asked me about my journey. I started with ASAE not quite 25 years ago. And came in. I mean, I've always, throughout my career, there have been volunteers involved in what I do, whether
Mhm.
it's Red Cross. I've done stuff with the Lung Association, with the Heart Association. I was in body parts for a while, is what I tell people. That's where I started and moved on. But there's always been that piece to it, you know.
So, in terms of the new century that we're in, and
Mhm.
the all the stuff that's happened with technology and so forth and so on, are there some trends that you see that may be a little different or a little require greater emphasis now than they did 25 years ago?
Well, certainly the volunteers, or at least there needs to be someone in the group who has a handle on the technology.
Mhm.
It keeps changing. Excuse me. It's not unusual to come into the office and the software say, "Oh, it's update." And you hit a button and it does the unexpected. And so there has to be comfort with how do you marry technology to the work. Some things don't require technology, but almost all of them do, if no more than to be able to communicate, being able to put out information in a place that anyone can access, which we weren't able to do before other than send an email. Now we have places, at ASAE, each group has its own site in our community software, that we store everything, so you're not held to, can I get a hold of my staff liaison to ask a question? Many of the things are where you can access 24/7. You don't necessarily have to talk to me to know what's next. And that becomes really important, and it's going to continue. There will be more and more things that will either be housed on a site, be available by video. Those things become important as people have questions as they do their work, whether it's something they're going to do for an hour or something they're going to do for a year.
Do you have any specific suggestions in the association community where we have the smaller association versus the larger association? Larger associations tend to have more resources and probably more members, but not necessarily. And
Yeah.
small
Yeah.
staff organizations have fewer resources, but still have to have volunteers.
Yes.
So
Yes.
have you noticed anything or a balance there or suggestions you can make for our smaller associations?
Well, I think for small associations, the volunteers become even more important. You do not have, 10 staff to assign to putting together your annual meeting. You just don't. I mean, you may not have 10 staff, you may have one. And so being able to recruit volunteers becomes extremely important. But the basics have to be handled. You have to know, what is it you need them to do? When do you need them to do it? How are they going to do it? And who, if they have questions, are they to address those questions to? And the methods, what's the mechanism that you're going to do it in? I think when you do that, whether you are a staff of one or a staff of 5,000, it's a good experience for the volunteers and for the staff. It has to be a mutually beneficial relationship. And so I think when you do those things, it becomes much easier to do, it encourages staff to want to work with volunteers more. But
Yeah.
it is important that it's just like hiring someone for a paid job. It really isn't that different. The volunteers are your unpaid staff. So the things that you would do with your paid staff, you need to look at, are those the same things I should be doing with my volunteers?
So, from your experience, what do you think associations need to do to support and promote the volunteer that has done the work? You
Mm.
know, is there an honorary? No, I guess there are no honorariums, but uh, how do we say thank you to our
Sure.
volunteers?
Well, I think there are actually lots of ways. And what's important to a volunteer is different. If you have social media, are you taking the time to highlight some of the work that they're doing and saying thank you in that way? Is your head volunteer, usually the chair of the board, taking time to put messages out to the larger core of volunteers and saying, hey, we see you. We think you're doing great work. Thank you for supporting us and supporting the membership. Um, it may be a letter at the end of their service, whether it's virtual or in paper, that says, you've completed your service. Thank you so much. Um, come again. you
Yeah,
know
sure.
Invite them to continue to volunteer, whether it's in a small way or a large way. But I think just seeing them often is enough to keep them going. Some organizations do have volunteer awards. Some of them do like a volunteer of the year. I've looked at that, and we talked about it internally several times. I think we tried it once and decided, that's maybe a little too disruptive. People get upset about, well, you didn't recognize me, and it's just better for all feelings, for everyone to feel that they've been seen if we find ways to recognize them individually. There have been times when we've written something to their boss. We at one point we were going to do it across the board. A few people came back and said, "No, please don't do that. Um, I don't want my boss to know I have time." Which is fair. Which is fair. It's not as if they're really doing the volunteer work often on the company's time. Maybe some of our meetings, an hour here and there. But it also brings eyes to the organization itself. If you're volunteering and you're speaking at our conference, you're helping to do webinars, you're writing an article, we're saying what organization you work for, or if you're a consultant, what the name of your consulting firm is. So it certainly is an opportunity. It's a byproduct of volunteering. You get recognition yourself as a volunteer, and people get to see the skill sets that you have. And they may be skill sets that you don't normally get to exhibit in your job.
Yeah. Here in the States, we are going through a dramatic new demography in our population.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion, speaking of ups and downs, it's had its ups and downs. I'm wondering, from your perspective, all your years of experience here, and the kind of pushback we're getting now from some areas, how do you deal with this need to ensure diversity, equity, and inclusion in the volunteer core, if you would?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think in some ways you have to look at your membership, the industry you represent. What does it look like? And what's its future? Because I can't think of an association that isn't concerned about its future and the future of the membership that it represents. And so, as the country diversifies in its makeup, then in order for your profession to survive, for your organization to survive, you have to be concerned that you are appearing to be as diverse as you can be. Maybe not today, but making plans for the future on how do we get our organization, our membership to look more like the rest of the world so that we stay alive. If you're trying to be here for the next 100 years, you can't do what you've always done. I have shared with the volunteer leaders what our volunteer corps looked like when I came. And it was not very diverse.
Bet not.
But 2 or 3 years ago at one of the retreats, I had a moment because I looked out among the leadership and thought, this is progress. And I encouraged them, I charged our leaders that were in the room that day to look around the room because there was representation, I felt, from every faction you could think of. And I charged them to keep that room looking like that for the future. You have to be conscious of it. Hence we started calling it conscious inclusion. What may be conscious inclusion in one association or one profession might be different for another. But you have to take a look at who am I representing? And above all else, what's our mission? Without that, none of this makes any sense. What's the mission of the organization? What's our membership look like now? What's the world look like right now? And what does that mean? And so once you know that, start planning for that future.
That's excellent advice. Do you see an evolving role for volunteers in associations that might be, I don't know, I don't like the word different, but uh, different in the sense of how they're used today versus how they were used decades ago? Or is it still pretty much the same but more individualized. But what's it like?
I would say it's more individualized. We are thinking more about, so what is it that people are coming into the volunteer ranks to achieve? And are we meeting that particular need? You cannot meet all of them, but you do have to think about that. And is it within the scope of the mission? But will things change? I think yes. Um, there is, I think, more strategic thinking about the mission and the work further down in volunteer ranks. So it's not just the board, you
Right.
know. It is in the committees. It is in just some of the general um, programs that we do. I think about Gold Circle Awards. So we
Mhm.
have an awards program for people organizations, their marketing, membership, advocacy types of campaigns. And they have taken a look at over the years at the membership, what kinds of applications are coming in, and helped us make some choices on how we do things to grow that program and expand its reach. And that takes more strategic thinking with staff, not just coming in and doing the work.
If you were to give advice to association leaders, excuse me, maybe one, two, or three things that you think would strengthen their volunteer program, what would you kind of list as those things that would help them do a better job to be more intentional and to strengthen their volunteer program?
Well, I think it becomes really important that everyone from the board downward, across the board, understands the priorities of the organization. What's our mission? What's our priority this year? And how what they are doing fits into that, and then make sure we are explaining in depth the different jobs that are available. And again, that saying thank you, I think it really is the basics. No matter what happens, you've got to be able to explain what we're doing, why we're doing, how we're doing, and then say thank you when the job is done.
Hearing you say thank you, I'm pretty sure I'm older than you are, without a doubt. And I always remember that old Captain Kangaroo thing. I don't know if you remember. He used to say the three most important words in the world are please and thank you.
Hmm.
And I think volunteers do want to be thanked, and it can be an oversight. The simplest of things really helps them want to stay connected. And I
Hmm.
thought another point you made here that was really important was this idea of connection to the mission, to
Hmm.
make sure they're connected to the
Hmm.
mission. So
Yeah,
be,
I think if you can build that connection to the mission, it helps everybody stay on point. I mean, we all have great ideas. We're passionate about the mission. We're passionate about the work. And staff does too. It's like we got 5 million ideas and no time or money to do it in, and a volunteer won't solve that either. And so it does become important, that we use that as a way of staying in line. We want to be in alignment.
it's you've been doing this for some time now. I'm wondering, if you could share what keeps you motivated to do this work because it's both, very specific and at the same time broadly strategic in
Mhm.
what you have to do. So what keeps you motivated?
Um, the thing that has kept me actually have been our members and being able to realize what my strengths were and who Wanda was, and actually look at what I do in volunteer management as my calling. And what it has allowed me to do is to step into this, take the bad with the good, and look and on those hard days, because there are hard days, look at who's serving, look at who has served as a volunteer, and look at how they benefited, how the profession has benefited. It gives me great joy to look out and see all types of our members and where they started when I met them and where they are now, and how that closer interaction with ASAE has helped them build better, to help them do more. And so when it gets tough, when things aren't going right, the software is giving me all kinds of fits, giving me wrong, erroneous information. It's like, I know that's not the answer. It is to look out and see our members and look at our volunteers and the work that they're doing and where it's going to land and watch them grow.
That's such wonderful feelings about how the volunteer thing keeps you motivated and should keep others motivated. Hey, if some of our friends who watch our podcast would like to reach you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
The best way to reach me is by email. So my email is wcoffey, WCOFFEY, at ASAE Center, one word, .org. And that way you don't have to worry about where I am. You can always call, but it's faster if you reach me by email. I think the volunteers figured that long time ago. I tell people I hardly ever get a phone call. If I get a phone call, I know you don't know me.
Well, Wanda, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience. It's wonderful to have you with us. I enjoy all the times that we've had an opportunity to
Yeah.
work together. And I think your advice is something that our friends on the podcast should listen to. And of course, your work with ASAE and the work of ASAE to help the association community is at the top of the way things need to be done. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, you are very welcome. I appreciate the invitation, Michael.
Friends, Association Futures is a forward-thinking podcast that delves into the future of associations. Our mission is to help associations and their executives navigate the ever-evolving landscape by anticipating trends, avoiding short-sighted decisions, and ensuring long-term success. Tune in again in 2 weeks to gain insights, foresight, and actionable strategies for your association's journey. Thanks again, Wanda. See you all soon.
Thanks, Mike.